Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. For now, I'm going to hand over to Abdullah from the Abidjan Convention, who will be giving us a quick recap of the past sessions. Over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you, Tara. Merci, Tara. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour et bienvenue à nos présentatrices d'aujourd'hui, Ingrid et Kirsten. Comme vous le savez, mesdames et messieurs, nous avons entamé ce processus d'élaboration ou de discussion sur la situation de la pollution marine dans la région de la Convention d'Abidjan, et plus précisément la pollution aux produits plastiques qui entrent dans nos océans. Le but étant de doter la région de la Convention d'Abidjan d'un cadre régional de gestion de la pollution plastique et plus tard d'accompagner les pays membres de la Convention d'Abidjan dans l'élaboration de leurs plans d'action nationaux pour lutter contre la pollution plastique et microplastique. Ce processus ou ce programme entre dans le cadre d'un partenariat entre l'UNEP et l'Union européenne dans le cadre du programme ACP-MEAs, donc les accords multilatéraux sur l'environnement dans les pays Afrique, Caraïbes et Pacifique. Le processus est conduit en partenariat avec SST, Sustainable Seas Trust, et son projet African Marine Waste Network. Nous avons eu jusqu'ici un certain nombre de présentations, mais vraiment d'une qualité exceptionnelle. Nous sommes vraiment très heureux jusqu'ici avec ce qui a été fait, aussi bien avec l'intervention de ces partenaires qui viennent du secteur privé. On a eu des entreprises comme Coca-Cola ou d'autres encore qui nous ont fait des démonstrations ou des présentations sur la façon, les politiques qu'ils ont engagées pour la gestion de la pollution plastique ou pour faire en sorte qu'il y ait moins de plastique qui finit dans l'environnement. Nous avons aussi entendu avec profit et délectation des présentations qui nous ont montré un peu que vraiment ce que nous recherchons ou ce dont nous parlons depuis un certain temps, à savoir qu'on cesse de considérer les déchets plastiques comme vraiment des déchets, mais plutôt comme de la matière première pour autre chose, donc dans le cadre de l'économie circulaire de façon globale dont nous parlons tout le temps. Nous avons vu des présentations, surtout les deux dernières, au Ghana, au Nigeria, qui ont montré comment lutter contre la pollution plastique ou percevoir les plastiques comme une matière première de quelque chose d'autre peut aider des femmes, des personnes qui généralement sont dans des situations de précarité ou de pauvreté à améliorer leur situation, à gagner des ressources qui peuvent être utilisées dans d'autres choses, comme par exemple l'éducation des enfants. Donc, c'est dire que nous pensons que nous sommes vraiment en train de ramener le débat au contexte qui est le nôtre, à savoir celui de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, de l'Afrique centrale et de l'Afrique australe, océanique, atlantique, pour envisager l'avenir de la lutte contre la pollution plastique de façon plus sereine et puis bien sûr à notre avantage. Donc sur cela, je ne vais pas être plus long. Je vais laisser introduire les présentatrices du jour qu'on va écouter bien sûr qu'on va écouter religieusement, avec beaucoup d'intérêt. À vous.
Thank you, Abdullah. I'm going to hand over now to Samuel Pillay from SST, who will be giving a bit of an introduction. Over to you, Sam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samuel. I'm a researcher at SST, working on the Sea-Based Sources of Waste project. And I will be providing an introduction to sea-based sources of waste, as well as introducing our panelists or our speakers for today. So just to give you an overview of sea-based sources or marine-based sources of waste, is waste that originates from vessels and is often lost, discarded, abandoned, or dumped from vessels into marine waters. If we look at policy of vessel waste, the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, MARPOL, is a policy document that has been implemented by the International Maritime Organization, which underpins the modus operandi of the global maritime sector. In essence, the types of vessel waste, waste management, and onboard vessels and at port reception is clearly stipulated in MARPOL's Annexes 1 to 5. Specifically, these types of waste are oil waste, noxious liquid substances, sewage, harmful waste, as well as garbage waste. Specifically, if we zoom into MARPOL's Annex 5, which this document discusses waste, which discusses garbage waste, it is divided into subcategories. According to this document, waste such as plastics, domestic waste, and fishing gear are strictly prohibited from being discarded at sea. If we try to understand the vessel waste problem, according to Jambeck et al., 2015, 70% of waste in our seawaters originates from land-based sources. However, the problem of sea-based sources of waste is difficult to quantify and predict, and therefore this leads to a major problem in fully understanding the full sources of waste. Specifically with plastic waste, food packaging, plastic bags, and even fishing gear pose great threats to the marine ecosystems. These impacts affect both marine and human populations. For example, when plastics are ingested by marine organisms, they lead to improper metabolic function, ultimately leading to the death of marine species. And if these marine organisms are fished for human consumption, the digestion of plastics also has several impacts on the human body. Fishing gear that is lost or abandoned at sea, abandoned due to environmental or climatic conditions while fishing, or dumped intentionally by individuals on board vessels, leads to ghost fishing, which can also cause entanglement or entrapment of marine species. Gear that attaches itself to marine life is often permanent, and the organism will be afflicted continuously by this gear, and in most cases, this affects the marine organism's ability in terms of its mobility and capacity to obtain food. Furthermore, attached gear can also have severe immediate consequences, leading to asphyxiation of marine life. Therefore, it is essential to understand the vessel waste problem and its effect on marine ecosystems. There exists great sparsity in documenting the vessel waste problem and the true extent of its impact on marine life. And therefore, we also need to work towards the development of best practice solutions for dealing with this waste. So once again, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is my brief introduction into sea-based sources of waste. I'm certain that our panelists will provide you with much more in-depth understanding. And without any further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Kirsten Gilardi. Dr. Kirsten Gilardi is a wildlife veterinarian at UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. She directs the California Lost Fishing Gear Recovery Project, a collaboration with fishermen that has removed more than 150 tons of abandoned, lost, and otherwise discarded fishing gear and other marine debris from California's coastal oceans. Gilardi serves on the Expert Advisory Council for the Global Ghost Gear Initiative and is a member of the Joint Group of Experts on Scientific Aspects of Marine Environmental Protection, which is referred to as GESAMP. GESAMP is a scientific advisory body to the United Nations, where she chairs a working group on ocean-based sources of marine debris. Our next speaker is Ms. Ingrid Giskes. Ms. Ingrid Giskes is the director of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, the GGGI, where she leads the policy agenda and portfolio of projects across more than 123 partners, including 18 national governments. Through her work, she has spent time with artisanal fishers in Vanuatu and in Indonesia to mark and track their fishing gear-led government and corporate roundtables, participated in gear removals, and presented at high-level policy and industry conferences. This includes the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, our Ocean Conference, as well as the United Nations Ocean Conference. She supported the fisheries technology team at FAO to implement voluntary guidelines for marking of fishing gear and the development of responsible fishing operations umbrella program. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Germanic Languages and Philosophy, a MSc in Germanic Languages, an MSc in Education, and an MSc in International Relations, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. Previously, Ms. Giskes undertook overseas development work in Cambodia, where she lectured at Zhejiang University and Hangzhou, working for Amnesty International in Australia on refugee policy, and has also worked for the World Animal Protection for 10 years in a variety of roles, including as the international head of Sea Change program, overseeing the ocean portfolio of 15 country offices, and chairing the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. Thank you all for once again joining us today, and without any further delay, I would like to hand over to our speakers.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for that very lovely introduction. I am going to share my screen and hope that you can all see my slides just fine. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm very pleased today to start out this webinar with a bit of a review of what we currently understand about sea-based sources of plastic. Samuel, you did a lovely job of both highlighting its major sources, but also I hope at the end of my presentation you'll understand we have a lot to learn still. So with that, I will, as Samuel mentioned, I am the chair of and a member of the Joint Group of Experts on Scientific Aspects of Marine Environmental Protection, otherwise known as GESAMP. We are an independent advisory body to the UN agencies. Our purpose is to provide authoritative, independent, interdisciplinary scientific advice to organizations and governments to support the protection and sustainable use of the marine environment. And our principal outputs or products, if you will, are a series of reports and studies that are posted on our website. These studies go back to the very origins of GESAMP decades ago with our very first working group, which is still in existence today. These reports and studies serve to establish essentially the base of knowledge on a topic and recommend areas for future work and opportunities for policy and management changes. In addition to reports and studies, GESAMP produces technical recommendations, policy recommendations, identified needs for science, and out of the work of GESAMP, a huge number of papers have been published in the scientific literature. So currently, there are several working groups active within GESAMP. You'll note that the very first working group 1, was established to conduct hazard evaluation of harmful substances carried by ships. Still in action is working group 34, which is reviewing applications for active substances in ballast water management systems. Working group 38 is looking at atmospheric inputs of chemicals to the ocean. Working group 40, of particular interest to this convention and this audience, I am sure, is the working group looking at sources, fate, and effects of plastics and microplastics in the ocean. Working group 41 is looking at the science underlying marine geoengineering. Working group 42 is looking at impacts of waste and other matter in the marine environment from mining operations, including marine mineral mining. And then the newest working group 44, is looking at biofouling management. But it was really this growing awareness and concern about the quantity of plastic entering the world ocean annually that inspired the formation of Working Group 43. As Samuel mentioned, there has been a sense and an understanding and a dogma that the majority of plastic in the ocean comes from land. And the ratio of 80% to 20% is used often. As mentioned also in your introduction, Samuel, thank you, was reference to Jenna Jambeck's paper published in 2015, which using a variety of sources of really good data and a lot of modeling estimated that 275 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year, and that this plastic is generated by 192 different coastal nations. But what we're also wondering is how much do our at-sea activities contribute to the global ocean plastic burden? And that's really what inspired Working Group 43. Sea-based sources of marine litter is our charge to better understand what are the sea-based sources of marine litter, with an emphasis, of course, on plastic. We were initiated in June 2019, and our sponsoring agencies are the International Maritime Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the UN Environment Program. There are 12 of us on the working group. We come from all over the world: China, India, Australia, England, Italy, Denmark. So very a good representation across the globe. It's been really my pleasure and honor to be the chair of the working group. And most importantly, we are in the final stages of producing our first reports and study. It has just come back from an external review process, so it will be up to me to look at all of the external comments, incorporate comments and content, and then it will be sent for formatting and publication. So I'm really going to use the rest of my presentation to give you a very high-level summary of what we have learned in conducting the report, and would just encourage you all to keep an eye on GESAMP's website in the coming months for publication of the report, which I haven't counted yet, but I believe we have reviewed several hundred papers published in the scientific peer-reviewed literature, as well as very many white papers and reports to develop the content of the report. So let's start with sea-based sources of plastic. Where are they coming from? As Samuel mentioned, they're coming from a variety of sources. Certainly shipping and boating is a source, whether it's because ships and boats wreck or are abandoned in the marine environment, or practice poor waste management on board, or whether they are container ships and they are losing cargo under heavy sea conditions. Shipping and boating is a source of marine plastic. We know that, and we cover this quite thoroughly in the report. As well, fishing is another significant source of plastic in the ocean. Fishing gear is abandoned or lost or intentionally discarded into the global ocean, and a significant portion of that fishing gear is comprised of plastic. And so again, an important source of plastic in the marine environment. Aquaculture is also a source, and important for us to consider, because aquaculture as an industry is on the rise globally. And the equipment that's used for culturing fish in the marine environment or in the coastal environment is, much of it is made from plastic, and it can be lost either due to catastrophic events, weather, poor waste management by farm managers, and really normal wear and tear will result in disintegration and breakup of the gear. Ocean dumping is, of course, still occurs with dredging spoils dumped at sea, and in some parts of the world, the quantity of plastic, especially microplastics in dredge spoils, especially dredge materials coming from harbors and ports, is quite high. There are various other sources or purposes for ocean dumping, but a growing area of concern I think we should all be considering, because given the number of satellites that are going up into space, is the intentional dumping of spacecraft in the ocean. And there are parts of the global ocean where hundreds of spacecraft have been intentionally dumped, and of course a good portion of that equipment is made of plastic. Let's not forget that there are other sea-based industries: oil and gas exploration, scientific research, weather monitoring, exclusion nets that are set up on beaches to keep predators away from areas that are popular for swimming and surfing, and artificial reefs, man-made structures underwater that are intended to attract fish to facilitate fishing. These are all potential sources of plastic. And again, these are all things that we're doing in the ocean that are potentially and are resulting in a plastic burden. And the next question is, well, how much? Well, we don't have definitive numbers. We have a lot of papers and reports that make estimates. For example, in a study conducted in the EU, was estimated that ships produce anywhere from 0.001 to 0.003 cubic meters of plastic per person per day. Well, that number is a little hard to contemplate, but if you consider a ship with a crew of say 100 people at sea for a year, that's the equivalent of several cement trucks full of plastic going into the ocean. In certain parts of the country, when people have done surveys for litter on beaches, a huge proportion of the litter has been traced back to shipping. For example, in Malta, in one study, nearly 80% of what was on shore that had, come in from the ocean was shipping sourced litter. With regard to aquaculture, there have been several papers that have estimated how much waste is generated by the industry. For example, in Korea in 1999, 38,700 tons of plastic into the ocean. In Norway in 2011, 12,300 tons in that year. And other papers have estimated that aquaculture produces 3,000 to 41,000 tons of plastic annually into the ocean. And again, with dumping, ocean dumping, as I mentioned earlier, really the highest levels of plastic particles are seen in the port and harbor sediments that become dredge material. And as mentioned earlier, 263 spacecraft purposely dumped at one point in the ocean since 1971. So again, what we have are many individual reports on sea-based sources of marine litter and the quantity that might represent. Of particular focus, of course, for me and for Ingrid is fishing. There is a number that is used and still used of that fishing results in 640,000 tons of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear into the ocean every year. That number is in the process of being refined as more and more people are looking at this problem. Most recently, the most recent global estimate was the result of a meta-analysis conducted by our colleague Kelsey Richardson, published in 2019, that estimates that 5.7% of fishing nets, 8.6% of fishing traps, and 29% of lines are lost annually. And that, again, was based on a meta-analysis of the existing literature. This is such an active area of science and inquiry that a new global estimate for the quantity of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear that ends up in the ocean is imminent. I think we can expect it in this next year in 2021. So another question we asked as GESAMP 43 was of these sea-based sources of plastic, what type of plastic? Well, as you can imagine, it's all of it, really. I mean, anywhere that, with the maybe slight exception of the more fragile and flexible and less durable plastics, plastic as an incredibly strong material is extremely convenient for use in a lot of ocean-based activities. Obviously, netting that's used in fishing and aquaculture is made from a variety of different plastics. Ropes and lines also as well, floats and buoys, extended polystyrene. You see here a picture of styrofoam buoys on the shores of, I believe this picture was taken in Korea. One of the biggest aquaculture-based sources of plastic are these extended polystyrene buoys that are used to keep nets afloat. Let's also bear in mind that we're talking about everything from very bulky items to microplastics. So in some places, as in this picture on the lower right, just plastic bottles, water bottles dumped over by any ocean user can end up in the ocean and can slowly degrade into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. And there have been several very well-known, well-reported cases of, for example, container losses, where containers have come off cargo ships and those containers have been full of pre-production plastic pellets, all of which have ended up in the ocean. So what are the impacts? No matter how you look at this issue, there are impacts across a variety of spectrums. I think as a veterinarian, of course, my interest in this problem of marine debris, and especially the problem of abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear, most concerned personally and professionally with how ghost gear can entangle and drown marine wildlife. And as a veterinarian, also very concerned with how ingestion, swallowing of ghost gear can cause fatal injuries to marine wildlife. But really the impact of fishing gear on marine wildlife is very significant. I'm sure Ingrid will go into that in a little bit more detail. But the losses are not just in wildlife morbidity and mortality, they're economic, both direct economic impacts. The loss of gear for fishermen is a huge economic hardship for fishers. Hidden costs, things like damage to vessels, and the requirement for costly repairs, costs for cleanup of marine debris, and that it's ocean-based is significant. Obviously, marine debris it degrades habitats. Well documented that it damages coral reefs. It can cover or cloak or essentially smother reefs and seagrass beds. Its presence on the seafloor can cause abnormal scouring of the seafloor. These all affect both micro and macro habitats that are essential for ocean biodiversity. Let's not forget that these sea-based sources of plastic and marine debris have social impacts as well. They really interfere with what I consider to be the common good space that is the global ocean. Tragically, marine debris, sea-based sources of plastic have also caused the loss of human life. And I don't think any of us will forget the sinking of the ferry the ferry So High in 1993, where, gosh, I believe almost 300 individuals drowned in that sinking, and that the ship sank because its propeller got completely wrapped in abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear. So again, impacts are very many, and are really why we are looking at this problem very, very closely. So I mentioned our report. We have reviewed, again, literally hundreds of papers and reports, and are summarizing what we know, but gosh, do we have more we need to learn. If there's one thing I hope our report will do when it comes out, is it'll point out and provide a bit of a roadmap for what else we need to be focused on going forward with new science and analyses in order to better understand and therefore solve this problem. Here's one of the big questions. Where is this coming from? What parts of the world contribute to sea-based sources of marine litter? And I've got this map on the screen here. This is a map we generated for our report. All the little red dots show where the papers that we've reviewed for this sea-based sources of marine debris report have been published. And you can see that it's very, very biased towards the Northern Hemisphere. There are parts of our global ocean for which we have very little information about sea-based sources of marine litter, including in the continent of Africa and South America. And so that is a big plea, I hope, that will come through strongly from this report, is that, and thankfully, this audience is extremely concerned with this issue and is going to help generate the data we need to better understand this problem. The other issue is, of course, it's much easier to generate data on marine debris from shore. So there are quite a few studies looking at what ends up on our beaches, but it's very difficult to trace that back to a geographic source. A water bottle that's washed up on a beach somewhere in the Mediterranean may have come from a ship or a vessel in the Mediterranean, may have come from a ship that came from somewhere else in the world and entered the Mediterranean. So that the geographic extent of the problem is still a big area for exploration and analysis. And there are many, many more gaps. So another challenge, of course, is distinguishing sea-based from land-based sources. A plastic water bottle in the ocean may have washed down from from a river, was dumped in a river way inland and came into the ocean, and may have been dumped at sea. There's a lot we still want to and need to know about the impacts of sea-based sources of marine litter. And in this case, with our GESAMP Working Group 43, of course, sort of nicely partners with Working Group 40, which is looking at microplastics and the impacts of microplastics on ocean life and on humans. So I hope to see some synergies there going forward. Standardization of methodologies to quantify inputs of marine litter into the ocean will be great to enable us to do these global comparisons. I've mentioned, where is it coming from? How is it getting there? There are still some big question marks, especially from a geographic standpoint. And a better understanding of socioeconomic and health impacts of sea-based sources of marine litter is going to help provide the impetus and drive for policy change. We also still, the jury's out on how much plastic is coming from sea-based activities. Again, I mentioned the 640,000 tons of fishing gear that enters the ocean annually is very old data and poorly substantiated, and thankfully, hopefully will be updated later this year. One of the ways to better understand how much waste might be coming from ships is for waste gap analyses to be conducted. You know what's on board a ship when it takes off from its home port, and you know what's on board when it arrives, and the gap can be surmised to have gone into the ocean instead of properly offloaded. And so we have very few of those analyses have been done. No quantification of microplastics and dredge materials has taken place. We don't have a good handle on how many decommissioned exploration platforms, artificial reefs, abandoned research sites, weather balloons, spacecraft, how many of those are going into the ocean every year is an area that we need to be focused on for sure. And so we spend a whole chapter of our report looking at what can be done to reduce and prevent sea-based sources of marine litter, plastic. Some significant recommendations include standardizing waste management protocols at ports. Currently, those waste management protocols vary so tremendously that it's actually can be to a ship's advantage to select a port in which to offload because of its waste management protocols may be more permissive. Obviously, reducing loss of cargo and aquaculture farm equipment is a fix that should be explored. Improving waste management practices on board vessels and on farms, and changing practices to reduce abandonment, loss, and otherwise discarded fishing gear is a very, very active area. And in fact, with that, I think now is the time to turn this over to my colleague Ingrid Giskes to talk to us about the Global Ghost Gear Initiative.
So thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Samuel. Thank you so much for having me here, Tony, Tara, and team, and for the introduction, Kirsten. So today I'll be talking about the problem of lost and abandoned fishing gear, building on what Kirsten has presented on so far, and also talk a little bit more about the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, which I'm the director of, and how we're trying to help address this problem at the global scale. So as Kirsten mentioned, the general term for ghost gear is a word for abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear, also called ALDFG. It is the most harmful form of marine debris, not only in terms of its impact perspective, in terms of entanglement and ingestion of marine wildlife, but also because of its impact on our fish stock levels. So really, it's a cross-cutting issue touching on marine pollution, but also food security and fisher livelihoods. And that's why it's such an important issue and the one that we should tackle with multiple stakeholders around the table. So on the right-hand side, you can see some of the percentages that Kirsten discussed as well. So it's really great to see some global efforts underway to update these numbers because they are quite outdated. And so at the moment, there are quite a few information gaps in terms of the volume of gear that is actually in our ocean, the volume of gear that is entering our ocean, and then the dispersion between different geographical regions, and then fishing gear designs as well. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll see some new papers come online that might guide our efforts in a better way as well. Just wanted to touch a little bit on the causes of ghost gear. I don't think that's been covered yet. Generally, it's understood that the unintentional causes of ghost gear are much greater than intentional discard. So unintentional direct causes could be adverse weather conditions, spatial pressures, malfunctioning of tracking systems, snagging on submerged features, etc. And so all of these unintentional causes are impacting the bottom line of the fishing industry. No fisher wants to lose their fishing gear, and that's why it's so important that we focus on promoting best practice management and really building the capacity of the fishing industry, fishing communities, and governments through, for example, action planning. There is some intentional discard as well, but that is often connected with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which obviously enforcement measures are more at play there, but I won't focus on those today. And then some of the indirect causes are mostly to do with the lack of disposal facilities, and that's why it's so great that the GESAMP working group both looks at shipping related and fishing related issues with marine debris, as disposal facilities are often related to some of the port infrastructure at play. So it's great to have both FAO and IMO on board as stakeholders in this area. So what is the Global Ghost Gear Initiative? The Global Ghost Gear Initiative is the only global cross-sectoral alliance committed to driving the solutions of the problem of lost and abandoned fishing gear worldwide. It's housed under Ocean Conservancy's Trash Free Seas portfolio, and it's been active since 2015. So I've been at the helm of the initiative since that time, and in the last 5 years, we've seen an immense growth in the initiative, both in terms of interest, science, projects, and best practices that have come online. So our aims of the initiative are threefold: to improve the health of marine ecosystems, protect marine life from harm, and safeguard human health and livelihoods. And in those aims, you can see again the cross-cutting nature of the issue of ghost gear, touching on marine ecosystems, but also those that depend on the health and sustainability of our ocean. We work across the 3 R's: reduce, remove, recycle, and to tackle the problem of lost and abandoned fishing gear, both from a preventative, mitigative, and curative point of view. And obviously, we recently saw the Glow Litter project come online. So I think we've got good company of a second global alliance now. So we're not the only kids in the sandbox anymore. Next slide. So in terms of our global reach, we have more than 123 member organizations and growing every day, including the support of 18 national governments, and about 23% of our membership is comprised of the private sector industry. As you can see, we don't have any member governments in the Africa region yet. We've hosted a number of workshops there. And we have a couple of active projects, which I'll highlight in the second part of my presentation, but no African member governments yet. So hopefully this presentation today could maybe set the scene for that to happen in the near future, recognizing that especially the West African region is an important stakeholder region for us as well. So this slide's a little blurry, probably because there's so many logos on here. So this is just to give you an idea and a snapshot of who our partners are. So you can see a wide range of NGOs, academia, corporations, both from retail, fisheries industry, and governments as well. So the Global Goes Gear Initiative is definitely a growing family, and we welcome new members into our fold every week. So in terms of a couple of the stakeholder groups that we work with really closely, both around raising awareness on the issue, but also on coming up with action plans to tackle the problem, the first group is really our industry engagement. So we work really closely with and for industry to raise awareness on the issue, but also learn from industry what might work, what might not work, and what the drivers around gear loss could be. We've had some great successes in terms of developing innovative solutions with them to minimize gear loss and also reduce impact, and also to look at disposal options, for example, of end-of-life fishing gear or projects around recycling. And the most important thing for us is that all solutions are ambitious, but also viable, lasting, and really make sense, because otherwise they're never going to be implemented. And apart from all of the solution building we do with industry, we also do action planning. So there are a couple of our industry members, Thai Union, for example, who have built dedicated Goes Gear action plans on which they report year on year, actually every quarter in a public way. And so those action plans are a great way to get industry started on some of the best practices that they can implement in their supply chain. And the Global Goes Gear Initiative is here to assist with advice, technical expertise, etc., on some of those action plans as well. So if you're interested in that, I can definitely circulate a few more links to showcase what our industry members have done so far. Another important stakeholder group are our governments. I see that the font of this slide is not perfect, but I think you get the gist. So what we do with our 18 governments is really looking at an evaluation of their national fisheries, looking at what their high-risk fishing gear types are, and also what potential hotspot areas might mean. So we are working quite closely together with FAO and rolling out global gear loss assessment surveys to really identify these issues in more detail and also contribute to that new updated 640,000 ton figure. We also work closely together with governments to develop revisions to their fisheries management plans. For example, in Vanuatu, we work together with the government there to update their FAD management plan, and that's something that we're interested in doing more of. And we also work together on the development and revision of marine litter action plans or Goes Gear specific action plans, which we've done quite successfully in a number of countries, including, for example, Panama and the UK. And then also we facilitate the support from governments for specific solution projects, both in their domestic waters as well as internationally. So there is a suite of options available for governments to engage in the initiative, and action planning is definitely one of the things that we see as one of the most valuable options to really drive change to the problem. So just to give you a few examples of what governments have done so far, in case you're wondering if any African governments would join, what that could look like. So, there's a suite of options here. So from hosting capacity building workshops to providing funding for our work, support for the development of technical guidelines, or implementing new technology systems in different regions around the world. There's a range of things here that governments can do. So this is just a snapshot of what different governments have included in their action plans or their Goes Gear work plans upon joining the initiative. So as I think has shown through my presentation a little bit already, is that we have 3 pillars in our approach to Goes Gear. We're looking at building evidence, which obviously GESAMP Working Group 43 and the work that Kirsten and her colleagues are doing is essential to. We also look at defining best practices or good practices and informing policy. And then also we look at capitalizing and replicating solutions. And so we very much feel that these 3 pillars go hand in hand with each other. So when we build evidence, that can inform what best practices might look like, what solutions can look like. However, our solution projects also generate new evidence that then can contribute to informing if a best practice can work or not work. So it's 3 pillars, but they are in a continuous feedback loop with each other and with the GGGI team, which is comprised of the leadership team, which is myself and some of my colleagues, our expert advisory council, which Kirsten is part of, and then we also have 3 working groups. So to talk about one of the pillars here is our best practice framework for the management of fishing gear. So it's one of the key tools that we launched in 2017, and we actually have done an update on this framework, and we'll be relaunching that in the next 2 months as well, including newest science and some new case studies as well. So what the best practice framework for the management of fishing gear really does is providing comprehensive guidance referencing all major actors in the seafood supply chain along the gear life cycle on what they could do on the prevention, mitigation, and recovery or remediation of fishing gear. So the first thing that we did was a general risk assessment, looking at the different types of fishing gear and their likelihood and impact of being lost, or the impact that they would have after they would be lost. And it came out that gill nets are definitely the most harmful type of fishing gear, followed by pots and traps, and then fish aggregating devices. And so those three are the three types of fishing gear that we generally focus on, but obviously we're looking at all fishing gears. And this best practice framework, it's not meant to just be a boring document sitting on the shelf somewhere, but it is kind of our key tool for action planning, both in the corporate supply chain as well as with governments. And we've seen a successful uptake of some of the recommendations in this framework in policies, sourcing policies, CSR documents, fisheries management plans, seafood companies. And I noticed that many of our recommendations are coming through the GESAMP report as well. So they are kind of a global standard of what can be done to address ALDFG or prevent ALDFG. The second pillar is building evidence. So apart from the effort that Kirsten and her team are undertaking, the Global Ghost Gear Initiative also has a global data portal, which houses the largest collection of ghost gear data on Earth at the moment. Again, this data portal was launched in 2015, and we are relaunching it next month in a 2.0 version with new functionalities, new reporting mechanisms, new public access to some of the aggregated data. But also we have some private pages as well for some of our industry members on there as well. So make sure that you go to the website below here on the slide and make your profile, and then you can browse some of the data that we have available, especially a bit later in April when that new version launches. And the aim really of these data obviously is to contribute to that global assessment of what the global image of lost and abandoned fishing gear might look like. And then the third pillar, which is some people say the most fun pillar, are our solution projects. So we have a range of solution projects that are currently live. We always say 17 active projects, but I think it's actually more than that, given that we've just made 5 small grants awards as well. And so we are active all around the world, from Nigeria, Indonesia, Mexico, Caribbean, Vanuatu, United States, and Canada. And these are just a couple of examples of the project work that we do. In Indonesia, for example, we work on the marking of fishing gear, really implementing the FAO voluntary guidelines for the marking of fishing gear there. And that project is in its 3rd year of its work. In the Caribbean, we are doing hotspot mapping analysis, as well as deploying innovative fishing gear and doing some virtual capacity building workshops with fishers as well. In Canada, we've supported a number of gear removal projects and are also doing hotspot mapping work in the Great Lakes area. And then in the United States, our main region of action is the Gulf of Maine and around Rhode Island as well, where we're doing some gear removals, recycling drives, and also promoting best practices with fishers. And then in Vanuatu, still very active on the tracking and marking of anchored fish aggregating devices. But the project, because of its geographical relevance that I really wanted to highlight today, is the work that our partner SOFA, Stand Up for Environment Restoration in Nigeria, is doing. So the SOFA initiative, they have a project called Fishing Net Gains. They were first awarded a Joanna Tool Ghost Gear Solutions Award last year, which kickstarted their work. And then since then, they've been able to secure a lot more funding to progress their initiative. And so they promote effective fishing gear recycling and end-of-life gear disposal by the installation of hub nets. And you can see here on the right-hand side such a hub net, which is really a simple wooden structure where end-of-life fishing gear can be responsibly disposed of. They also buy back old gear for reconditioning, for example, through art workshops with community groups that they have been running. And they also have done some data collection, gear removal work as well. And it's really a great example of a community-led initiative with an amazing impact that is growing year on year. And that is really working across the 3 pillars of prevention, mitigation, and remediation. So they are doing all the things really in Nigeria. And so it's such a wonderful example of what is possible and something that we'd love to replicate with key actors all across Africa as well. So I'll leave you here with my contact information. Please know my email address has changed recently. So I'm now under the Ocean Conservancy umbrella here. I look forward to receiving any questions, any comments that you have, and hopefully we can build our presence in the African region a little bit more in the years to come. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Ingrid. It's wonderful to hear about all the research that's being done. There have been a few questions that have come through in the chat box so long. The first one is saying, given the diverse origins of plastic waste in the marine environment, how can the responsibility of polluters relate to the waste found in territorial waters of coastal states or the coasts of countries? And how can we follow the traceability of waste illegally discharged by ships? Would anyone like to comment on that?
I'll speak to the traceability of waste to shipping. I think, you know, part of our conclusion with regard to the problem of waste from shipping, and let's bear in mind that, of course, as a problem, this has been recognized for decades, and is why the MARPOL in Annex 5 was created and agreed to by the world. I think there's, of course, still the waste that comes from shipping, and let's be honest, fishing vessels, and separate from abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear, there's also plastic debris that comes from just the fishing industry. You know, part of the issue is that there is no requirement or accountability for what is on the ship when it leaves port and what comes back. And so part of that is, you know, matter for harbors and ports to get together and commit to providing better waste reception facilities for ships as they come into port, so that if they are going to do the right thing and manage the waste on board until they get back to port, they have a place to put it. And as you noticed from Ingrid's, the last example she shared from the SOFR initiative in Nigeria, that, you know, providing fishers with the opportunity to do the right thing with the gear that they are not going to use anymore is really provides an incentive to not use the ocean as a dump site for this waste. So, but in terms of better understanding at-sea sources and differentiating them from land-based sources, this is a key question, and I think it's going to come down to working directly with the industries that are operating on the water to understand how much waste they're generating and how much they're bringing back to port. And yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question. I hope I did, but please let me know if you have a follow-on question. Thank you.
I was just going to add to Kirsten's excellent response that, you know, in some countries or regions, they are looking at an EPR scheme for fishing gear to really improve that traceability under the motto of the polluter pays. And so I think in some countries, especially in Europe, that's already starting to be implemented, but it's also showing how difficult it is to implement, given that there's so many different types of fishing gear being used and moved around all around the world. So I think in the future, once you know, that the success of the implementation of an EPR scheme has been shown in a couple of countries or a couple of regions, that could be something that definitely could help with traceability of fishing gear and also quantifying kind of the amount of fishing gear that reaches the end of its life or ends up in our ocean and how that happens. So yeah, I think EPR might play an important role here as well.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Ingrid. There's another question that says, that's directed at you, Kirsten, that says, thank you for the very rich presentation. You mentioned the amount of 275 million tons of plastic waste coming from 192 coastal countries every year. Do we have an idea how much comes from non-coastal countries and flows into rivers?
Oh, I wish we did. You know, I think The assumption is that much of that waste is coming from coastal cities in coastal countries with a certain amount generated upstream. But I'm not aware of studies, although with the caveat that I have not delved into, my focus has been so heavily on sea-based sources that I've not spent a ton of time in the literature on land-based sources of marine debris, other than to have a general sense that the studies that have looked at what is getting carried into the ocean from coastal cities by rivers and waterways tends to emphasize the amount of waste coming in from those cities, with the thought that plastic waste going into rivers further upstream may or may not make it all the way out to the ocean. But it's a great question, and definitely one that we should be looking at, because I think your point is it shouldn't just be the coastal nations that are held responsible for the input of marine debris into the ocean. Many coastal nations bear the brunt of the things that happen further inland. And so I think it's a very important area for further investigation. Thank you for the excellent question.
Thank you, Kirsten. The next question is, within the framework of the Abidjan Convention, is there a financial or technical mechanism to support the coastal states and parties to the said convention to rid territorial waters of the coastal plastic waste, or coasts, sorry, of plastic wastes? Kirsten or Ingrid, I'm not sure if you have any comments for that. Otherwise, Abdullah, I'm not sure if you want to make a comment.
I think the only comment I would make is that, you know, as coastal nations consider their responsibility for as a source of sea-based sources of marine debris, I think, you know, the cost of mitigating and ameliorating the impacts far exceeds the cost of preventing. I mean, I think the adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is certainly true. And where countries can implement measures that prevent the problem in the first place, in the long run, it will cost society less. It will certainly, you know, any costs that are incurred by individual operators, whether those are fishermen or shipping companies, will be really, you know, minimal compared to what it costs society to clean up the plastic, remove the abandoned, lost, and discarded fishing gear, clean up the beaches. So that would be my quick response to that question. Ingrid, you may have more to add.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point. Prevention is always better than mitigation or cure, and much cheaper as well. I think in terms of specific finance mechanisms, through the Global GGGI initiative, obviously we run a number of programs and solution projects. So countries can apply for support there, and also the FAO Global Partnerships project will be implementing finance mechanisms for developing countries as well, especially to support some of those efforts. So I think, I don't know, maybe Abdullah might have some more to add here on the Abidjan Convention side of things, but I would just, if there's an interest there, keep in touch with us. We do launch twice a year a grant cycle, small grants program, you know, which can be of interest there, and then maybe contact FAO as well. I can put my colleagues' email in the chat box here as well for other financing mechanisms.
Merci, thank you Ingrid, thank you Kirsten. Merci à toi pour la question. La Convention d'Abidjan, déjà ce travail que nous faisons ici, cette rencontre que nous avons là, ce webinaire-là, il entre dans ce cadre. Parce que ces experts que nous faisons venir, nous cherchons à profiter, à bénéficier de leur expérience. Ce que Kirsten a expliqué ici, de ce que le GESAMP fait, et ce que Ingrid a présenté aussi par rapport à ces filets fantômes qui sont perdus donc ou abandonnés. C'est sûr que moi, j'ai perçu là-dedans, j'ai d'ailleurs posé une question à Ingrid pour comprendre un peu quel est le mécanisme, la procédure selon laquelle ils choisissent les pays où ils interviennent. L'idée derrière, c'est de voir comment, dans le cadre du processus que nous engageons ici, nous allons pouvoir bénéficier de leurs expériences à tous les deux. Ce que la Convention d'Abidjan propose, c'est d'abord le cadre de coopération pour les 22 pays membres. de la Mauritanie à l'Afrique du Sud, pour savoir déjà comment avoir un cadre légal de gestion de la pollution plastique. Et une fois qu'on a fini cette phase-là, on va engager une seconde procédure qui va être d'accompagner les pays dans l'élaboration de leur plan d'action pour lutter contre la pollution plastique. Mais nous sommes d'accord, votre question a un sens vraiment qui met le point ou le doigt sur la partie qui risque de faire mal. C'est qu'une fois qu'on a défini les plans d'action, il va falloir aussi les financer. Il va falloir aller chercher de l'argent. Et c'est là que ce que Ingrid vient d'expliquer là, soit les small grants, soit d'autres mécanismes de recherche, de financement auprès d'autres partenaires techniques et financiers, c'est en cela que la création de cette communauté de pratiques que nous sommes en train de faire ici va nous pousser à développer la collaboration entre nos différentes structures pour aller chercher de l'argent. Mais encore une fois, d'ailleurs Ingrid l'a aussi mentionné un tout petit peu, le travail doit venir des pays eux-mêmes. Donc, il faut que les pays expriment le besoin pour que nous, les structures régionales, nous puissions accompagner la recherche de ces financements-là à travers les différents guichets qui existent. Donc, pour répondre directement ou clairement à votre question, c'est que nous allons offrir le cadre légal au niveau de toute la région et ensuite aider à développer, à élaborer les plans d'action. Et naturellement, si Ingrid ou Kirsten connaissent des guichets où on peut aller récupérer des subventions pour compléter les activités que nous engageons, c'est aussi que nous sommes en pourparlers avec la BAD, l'African Development Bank, l'UCN, le WWF et certaines d'autres structures pour essayer de trouver les moyens financiers qui vont nous permettre de faire face à ce colossal projet, parce qu'il s'agit d'un projet colossal. Aucune des structures ne peut conduire toute cette d'ailleurs. Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, thanks so much, Abdullah. My French is still good enough that I understood everything you said, which is good. But I'm going to reply back in English. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, yeah, the Global GGGI Initiative is really aims to really build that community of practice that you highlighted, sharing between countries and also building the framework that you need to then go into action planning and identify different countries. So in terms of your initial question, which countries and how do we identify them? Generally, it's country-led. So the country that shows an interest is the one where we will work with. We won't be forcing onto countries that they have to work on GGGI. So really, the initiative and the interest really has to come from the country in question as to, you know, how they're going to be working with us. We have worked with a couple of other UNEP regional seas conventions, for example, the Cartagena Convention. And what we've done there is really talked with them around which countries would be, on the one hand, have the biggest problem, but also have a leadership position to really show the other countries within the convention area what could be done. And so working with the convention, we identify one or two kind of champion countries first to then build an action plan for the entire convention region. So that's something that we could do with the Abidjan Convention as well, looking first at you know, what could be the countries that have the biggest problem from maybe a fishing perspective, and then looking at which countries have the greatest interest. And in my experience, generally, once you start the action planning process, we have multiple funders available that are interested in financing this work individually. So it can come through the small grants program, but it also can be by matching you with another donor that we have in our initiative as well. So there is definitely interest from other countries to fund capacity building efforts in the West African region specifically. So we'd be very happy to look with you at that, as well as World Bank and other opportunities as well. So I think we probably have a lot more to discuss after this webinar to maybe look at how we can get this process kick-started in the Abidjan Convention area, maybe alongside FAO as well.
Many thanks, Ingrid, and I know that we will be doing the same you did with the Cartagena Convention. You will do it with the Abidjan Convention. So we are waiting for you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Ingrid and Abdullah. There's another question here in the chat. I'm not sure if it's been covered, as my French is not not great. But there's a question for Kirsten that says, you mentioned some of the countries that are that participate in the working group, but these were largely based in the Northern Hemisphere. Are there any plans to reach out to other Southern Hemisphere-based countries, particularly in Africa, as environmental issues know no borders? What needs to be done to develop international research cooperation and involve researchers from the South?
Yeah, thank you for that excellent question, Abdullah. And a couple of things to say. One is, certainly when it comes to the body of research, the scientific literature on these subjects, many of the researchers have been funded by their governments to conduct the research in their national waters. And so that's part of the explanation, is that, in countries where governments are investing in the science, that science tends to be done in those countries or in the region. So I think that's part of the reason that unfortunately the preponderance of the scientific literature is Northern Hemisphere focused. That's not to say that we are not incredibly interested in more science being done in the Southern Hemisphere, especially in the African continent. And I think as Ingrid just mentioned, some opportunities for partnership for new science and project and solutions oriented projects through the Global Ghost Gear Initiative in partnership with the Abidjan Convention. I think, FAO is actively investigating and looking at the issue of abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear, ghost gear, resulting from both commercial and artisanal fisheries in parts of the world where we just don't have a good amount of data. So that is also an opportunity for scientists working in parts of the world that are, have been underfunded by their governments for the good work that they want to do, to partner with some of the international agencies for getting the support for that work, so that we can get a much more global understanding. And GESAMP is also, as a body, is always looking for experts in these areas from around the world. And so, I would encourage anybody participating in today's webinar who has an interest in the work of GESAMP and would like to contribute in some way to make yourself known to the chairs of the GESAMP working groups. All of that information is on GESAMP's website. The working groups terms of reference change over time, of course. So at Working Group 43, we had a set of 7 terms of reference that we needed to address in our work. We're now about to publish our first report, and it really is up to the sponsoring agencies whether there will be additional further areas of inquiry that the agencies would like GESAMP to investigate. And when there are new terms of reference, then GESAMP goes out and looks around the world to find the best people to serve on that working group. So I expect our composition will change. And the same could be said for all of the working groups of GESAMP, that they are not, the working groups change as the needs for the expertise change. And so, everybody is welcome to, if you have an interest in serving at that level as a volunteer, that's one of the things to keep in mind, is that it is all voluntary. We do this work not as a representative of our institutions. So it's a labor of love in many ways. But thank you for the very good question.
Thank you, Kirsten. There's another question here that says, within the framework of the fight against plastic pollution in the marine environment, can we not establish a tax to be paid by fishing and aquaculture companies in order to be able to gather the means to fight against plastic pollution?
Yeah, that's exactly what EPR would be. So implementing an EPR scheme would be, the principle is the polluter pays. So there would be some sort of tax on the gear manufacturers, the people producing the fishing gear, that would include kind of, the pollution costs basically, but also, it needs to go hand in hand with the risk assessment, the setup of infrastructure, tracing fishing gear, port reception facilities, so all of these things. So it's not as easy as just imposing a tax, but also it needs to have the full infrastructure or full network of preventative and mitigative options available to actually then trace the fishing gear and dispose of it responsibly. But it's a great idea. Just the implementation in practice requires a little bit more thinking I'm working through. But some countries have done it successfully, like in Norway. They have a full EPR scheme that is being implemented, and that has been working for a number of years quite successfully, but implementing it across a bigger country or a bigger region obviously is a little bit more challenging, but I do think it will be the future, but it's still the future, not the present.
Thank you, Ingrid. There have been a few comments here as well, looking to join your network. There's someone based in Lagos in Nigeria at an NGO who'd be interested in joining. I'm not sure, I think at the end of your presentation, you spoke about how members can go about getting in contact with you and joining.
Yeah, the best thing is I'll pop the info email address here again, and maybe my own as well, and my colleague Joel, who manages most of our membership. So I'll pop them here in the chat again, and people can follow up accordingly.
Thanks, Ingrid. And then there's also a comment from Do Stain that says Plastics SA, representing the South African plastics industry and support African plastics industry regarding Global Plastics Alliance, are doing some work on fishing gear, but we wonder how big the problem is in South Africa, and how does one become a member? Maybe Plastics SA and SST can work together and look to support other African countries. So thanks, Ingrid. If you could reiterate the the joining information, I'm sure that'd be very helpful. Then there's another question here from Sam that says the cost of waste disposal services have been identified as problems by fisheries. In studies conducted by GESAMP, with Working Group and GGGI, has this problem been identified in other countries? And do you think that the cost of waste disposal is contributing to fishing gear or general waste being dumped into seas?
Yeah, that's an unequivocal yes, that the problem with waste management opportunities at ports, whether they are available to commercial cargo ships or other fishing vessels, is probably a big contributor. And in fact, it's known that certain vessel, captains will choose one port over the other if they know that the requirements for waste management are not as financially burdensome. So that's in part why our shipping experts on Working Group 43 were very strong proponents of standardization of waste management at ports, so that there's not that sort of port hopping that happens, that's clearly guided by what is perceived by the operator of the vessel to be an easier place to bring that ship into port, and a less expensive place to bring that ship into port. Standardizing that all ports are going to have as a minimum, certain waste management facilities would go a long way towards stopping that sort of port jumping issue. But I think, even here in California, I've spent a lot of time in ports that are very active ports for commercial fishing, and there's very little opportunity for the fishermen to easily dispose of their gear. If they're going to be responsible about it, they get it loaded into a big truck and they take it to a municipal landfill for disposal, but that's likely not always the case. And so of course, it costs to set up these systems, there's no question, but in the long term, I believe that the cost is minuscule in comparison to the cost to the global ocean, to the ecosystem, to wildlife, to the industries that themselves suffer from the presence of marine debris in the ocean. Kind of pales in comparison. So I really do hope that nations and regions are looking closely at what they can do on land to really facilitate and support ocean industries to be better stewards of the waste that they generate, and bring that on shore instead of dumping in the ocean.
Thank you, Kirsten. That's great to hear. Well, not great to hear, but it's great to get your input on that. We think we have time for a few more questions. There's one here that says, thank you both for the great presentation. My colleagues and I have established a small organization based on marine environment and habitat, and they currently collect plastic waste and raise awareness. We mostly collect from beaches. After we collect, we hand over to private trash companies, and they burn the plastic and other trash, which is also a problem. Are there any solutions to this? I'm not sure if either of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I'll comment. And, you know, that is a really, really, really important thing for us to consider, is that just because we move the debris from one place and take it to another doesn't mean that on a global scale it's not continuing to be damaging in terms of the chemicals that result from incineration of plastic wastes. And obviously where waste management facilities can install, you know, the equipment that's needed to reduce the amount of contaminants that are getting into the air and the atmosphere is of course desired. You know, ships are required to have equipment on board to reduce the amount of the pollution that's generated through their combustion engines. And so I think we need to be thinking about similar options for the safe management of plastic waste, and that it's not, where and when it is burned or it's buried, that it's not just simply handing off the problem, the toxicity of this material to the next generations. So it's a significant issue for sure. And, you know, there are many, many countries where, you know, the management of solid waste is not good. There may not even be a good system for managing solid waste in some countries. And so simply taking that waste from the ocean and transferring it to land doesn't always do the earth the favor of that removal effort. So there needs to be a holistic approach. There's no question.
Ingrid, did you want to comment on that as well? It looked like you were about to say something before.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, I agree with everything Kirsten said. And I think in terms of the burning of waste or even fishing gear going to landfill, like, you know, the options available to each country are dependent on the cultural context and the geographical context as well. Like, for example, in the US, there might be an option to recycle fishing gear into new nylon products. However, in a small island like Vanuatu, due to its remoteness, they might not have that option. And so landfill might actually be the most responsible disposal method of fishing gear. So it really depends on the country context. And we really try at the GGGI not to finger point, you know, what solution is good or bad. We need to do what is possible. In general, we're always a bit wary of incineration of plastics, like things like waste to energy, just because we're all aware of the climate change crisis that we're in right now. And burning plastics for incineration or waste to energy don't always go hand in hand there. But that being said, for some communities, that might be the only option. Like I know in Hawaii, there's some really innovative work going on with waste to energy. And again, it's a small island nation. There is only so many opportunities for recycling or responsible disposal into landfill. And so that, you know, might just be the only option of technology available. And so I think the most important thing is to keep end-of-life fishing gear out of the water, preventing it from ending up in the ocean. And then secondly, looking at what options are available for the country in question, or what options can be developed together with the country.
Thank you, Ingrid. I think we have time for one last question, which is we have a few studies on plastic in the Abidjan Convention areas, but generally they are based on literature. The Abidjan Convention would like to conduct a scientific field study to characterize plastic pollution in the region. How do you think this would be able to work? Kirsten, I don't know if you want to comment.
Oh, please do. And I know many of us would be delighted to contribute however we can to a project as you're proposing here. So I guess what I would say is, you know, let us please stay in touch after this webinar and perhaps discuss how a study like that might go forward, and what are the resources needed, and, you know, are there opportunities for collaboration that that we could identify. But you have our full support. We would very much like to better understand the problem in your region, and would like to do whatever we can to support that. So please do. Let's stay in touch. Let's do it.
Yeah,
Perfect.
and I just to add, you know, FAO has developed standardized survey formats for all types of fishing gear now. So all the metrics and methodology of such a study are pretty much there, not completely finalized yet, but almost there. And so identifying the right partners, and then, you know, GGGI can help with identifying the right financing mechanism as well to do such a study. I think everything's kind of lining up to actually make this a reality in the very near future. So yeah, exciting.
Thank you so much.
So I suggest without no delay to plan to have a meeting to discuss these questions and see how to move forward.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. There are also some contact details and web addresses that have been posted in the chat if people are looking for more information. Tony, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you very much. There are a couple of issues that came up. Firstly, to both of you, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Well, the two excellent presentations, very valuable indeed. There are really interesting aspects of Africa which we need to consider. And to a large extent, the majority of the people of Africa depend upon small-scale fisheries. And they themselves very often make their own nets, etc., which makes it very difficult then to apply an EPR system. On the other hand, the trawlers and trawl systems are actually really operational in very few parts of Africa, South Africa being one of them. But there are trawl impacts in Africa, principally on the east coast from Asia and along the west coast from Europe, not only, of course, and they often discard materials too. So much of the impact that we have in Africa is contributed by other countries. And then I thought that what would be important to this discussion is to recognize that we started working with Ingrid and others before, and now what the African Marine Waste Network is doing is trying to apply the GGGI and also the GESAMP attitudes and approaches to African conditions. And so the team in the African Marine Waste Network, and Abdullah, in fact, is on the advisory panel, so he knows about them too. It's working on adaptations for Africa because the circumstances in Africa are so different from many other parts of the world, and the circumstances in Africa and the cultural aspects in Africa vary from one site to the next within countries, and very definitely from one country to another. So this is an important way forward. So I think it is excellent that we had this set of presentations today, so that we can now consider the way forward together. And Ingrid and Kirsten, don't forget that the next conference of the African Marine Waste Network, which is towards zero plastics to the seas of Africa, which includes from ocean-based sources, is in April next year. And I do think that it'd be very good for you to be part of that conference. I know that Ingrid was going to be planning to come to the last conference we had, but COVID put an end to that for all of us. But it is now going to be next year in April. So just a comment on that. But I thought the two lectures today were superb, and thank you very much for those.
Thank you, Tony. I certainly would welcome the opportunity to meet again at future conventions. And I wanted to also acknowledge your very important point, which I probably did not make as clearly as I could in my presentation, which is that, yes, absolutely, a lot of this marine sea-based sources of marine litter end up on the shorelines of countries and they were put in to the ocean by other countries elsewhere in the world. And I mean, it's been very clearly demonstrated, for example, with the amount of waste that's going into the ocean from land in Southeast Asia. Much of that waste, because of ocean currents, ends up on the coral reefs and beaches of Northern Australia, where it's been documented to cause really devastating impacts on corals and wildlife. So very important point, Tony, is that the waste that's on the beaches of countries doesn't always come from industries based out of the ports and harbors of those countries. Very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, in many parts of Africa, the nets in particular, in the seine nets and other nets that they use from in the small scale fisheries, are so incredibly valuable that they just cannot afford to use them. And an enormous amount of time are spent in protecting them and repairing them. And that's where the other waste is a problem. In some places, in fact, Ghana is one of them, sometimes there's just so much plastic debris in the water that itself is damaging to the nets themselves. So really interesting. Yeah, so definitely scope. And then mentioned by one of you, I can't remember which, is that, again, the issues are so great on land that it is much better for Africa as a policy to invest in the prevention on land rather than try to clean up what is happening within the sea and on the beaches, particularly given that much of Africa has high energy coasts.
Yeah, I was just going to add my thanks to Kirsten and Tony. So thank you so much for having us. And Tony, I look forward to being all together, all vaccinated and healthy next year. I think, you know, as you've said, our oceans don't have any borders, and that's what we see with fishing gear moving around, but neither have the solutions on ghost gear. They don't have any borders either. So, you know, what we've done in one area might be really applicable in Africa and in the Abidjan Convention area as well. So we look forward to making the borders between us all disappear, being together, sharing knowledge, sharing tools, and making addressing this problem in the West African region really a reality in the near future, and learning from all the things that you've already done so successfully. So thank you so much, and hopefully this webinar could be kind of a second kickstart to our collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid and Kirsten. It's wonderful to hear about all the collaborations that will hopefully happen going forward. I think we can end off here for today, but thank you both so much for presenting for us. It's been wonderful to hear about your experience and your insights. We do have another session taking place on Thursday, but in the meantime, Tony, I'm not sure if you want to close off the session for today, and we can just mention Thursday's presentation.
Right, well, I've already said thank you, and it really is sincerely meant. Both of you were wonderful. You spoke with authority. I thought that the quality of the presentations were also excellent. I'd also like to thank very much the translators. Once again, superb that you're not only helping us, but you're doing a great job. And as indicated last week, when we moved from looking at the plastics and so forth, in terms of the industries, we're now moving on to the science. Last week, we actually handled the science on land and the land-based aspects and measurement. Today, we handled and covered aspects in terms of development of action plans regarding sea-based sources. And then we're going to be moving into education and its role in the development of action plans on Thursday. And it's going to be Judy Lang, who's really an excellent researcher, educator, and really worthwhile listening to, because she's a thinker and a lead thinker on these issues. So from my perspective, from African Marine Waste Net and Sustainable Seas Trust, thank you very much. Abdullah, would you like to thank from the Abidjan Convention?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to all the attendees and the speakers. It's been a very fruitful webinar, and we're looking forward for the next step. And thank you. See you soon.